to Henry de Grue. Jacques felt utterly vile. It was revolting to remain there in the dark like some sacrilegious spy while that woman, whom he didn't know from Eve, was making her confession. But then he should have left at once, the moment the priest in his surplice arrived at her side, or at the very least made some noise, anything, to alert them that a stranger was present. Now it was too late. The wretched indiscretion could only grow more monstrous. Idle and restless, seeking like a woodlouse some cool refuge at the close of a sweltering day, he'd indulged in an impulse quite unlike his usual whims. He'd wandered into the old church and settled into a dim recess behind the confessional, intent on daydreaming while the rose window faded with the light. But after a few minutes, without knowing how or why, he found himself the wholly unwilling witness to a confession. True, he couldn't make out the words distinctly. For the most part, it was a low murmur, a penitential murk of hushed syllables. But toward the end, the exchange seemed to gain in urgency. Here and there, a few syllables rose above the murmur, breaking through the opaque tide of contrite babble. And the young man, who, by some miracle, was the opposite of a scoundrel, began to fear he might overhear a confession never meant for his ears. Then, suddenly, that dread was realized. A violent disturbance seemed to ripple the stillness. The stagnant waters parted with a roar, as if to release a monster from the deep, and Jacques, gripped by a terror that crushed the breath from his lungs, heard these words hurled in a desperate, impatient voice. "I'm telling you, Father, I put poison in his tisane!" Then, nothing. The woman, her face still hidden, rose silently from the kneeler and vanished into the thicket of shadows. As for the priest, he sat as motionless as a corpse. Long, slow minutes passed before he opened the door and departed in turn, his step the heavy, stunned gait of a man struck down. It took the persistent jangle of the verger's keys, along with a booming command to clear the nave, before Jacques finally rose to his feet, like so thoroughly shattered was he by that single sentence, still echoing inside him like a cry from the abyss. He had recognized her voice, his mother's voice, without the slightest doubt. There could be no mistaking it. He'd even recognized her gait when that silhouette of a woman had risen, barely 2 steps away in the dark. But what did that mean? Everything collapsed at once. Everything cracked and fell away. The world turned out to be a monstrous joke. He lived alone with his mother, a woman who saw almost no one and ventured out only for church. He had grown accustomed to revering her with all the fervour of his soul, as a singular model of righteousness and kindness. As far back as he could remember, there had been nothing murky, nothing crooked, no shadows, no detours. Her life was like a long, pale road stretching out beneath a wan sky, and it had been a melancholy life, that much was certain. Ever since her husband, his father, had died at Champigny, a man he barely recalled, she had mourned without ceasing. She had devoted herself entirely to her son's upbringing, never leaving him for a single day. She had refused to send him to school, like fearful of what he might encounter among other children. She took full charge of his education, building his soul piece by piece from fragments of her own. From that upbringing he had inherited a tender, nervous sensitivity, a delicacy of temperament that left him vulnerable to absurd little sorrows, and perhaps even to very real dangers. When adolescence arrived and brought with it the inevitable mischiefs she could not prevent, she had become more sorrowful. Yes, but her gentleness never dimmed. There were no reproaches, no cold silences. Like so many other mothers, she had resigned herself to the inevitable. Everyone spoke of her with respect, and yet he alone, her only beloved son, was now being forced to despise her on his knees, with tears in his eyes, as angels might despise God if ever he failed to keep his promises. It was enough to drive one mad, to make a man howl in the street. His mother, a poisoner? It was insane. It was madness squared, cubed, multiplied to infinity. It was absolutely, categorically impossible. And yet it was true. She had confessed it herself. He wanted to tear his head from his shoulders. But poisoner of whom? Good God! Who in their circle had died of poisoning? Not his father, who had taken a blast of shrapnel to the gut, and certainly not himself. She would never have tried to kill him. He had never been ill, had never even needed a tisane, and he knew, beyond doubt, that she adored him. The first time he'd come home late one evening, and not for reasons that could be called virtuous. She'd made herself sick with worry. Could it have happened before he was born? His father had married her for her beauty when she was barely 20. Had there been some earlier affair, some hidden tragedy in her past that involved a crime? No. That past had been told to him 100 times, and everything about it rang clear and true. The testimonies were beyond dispute. So why in God's name, had she made that terrible confession? More to the point, why had he been the one to hear it? Drunk with horror and despair, he stumbled back home. His mother rushed to embrace him. "Why, you're so late, my dear boy. And how pale you are. Are you feeling ill?" "No," he answered. "I'm not ill, but this heat is exhausting, and I don't think I can eat." "And you, mother, are you feeling all right? You went out, I suppose, to get a bit of air? I thought I saw you from a distance on the quay." "I did go out, yes, but you couldn't have seen me on the quay. I went to confession, which I believe you haven't done in quite some time, you scoundrel." Jacques was astonished not to choke, not to collapse where he stood, struck down as in the more vivid novels he'd read. So it was true. She had gone to confession. He hadn't dozed off in the church. That abominable catastrophe had not been some fevered dream, as he'd allowed himself for a fleeting moment to hope. He didn't faint, but he grew even paler, and his mother took fright. "What's the matter, my little Jack?" she asked. "You're suffering, I can see it. You're hiding something from your mother. You really should have more trust in me. You know I love only you, and have no one but you. How you look at me, my darling treasure. What is the matter? You're frightening me." She folded him tenderly into her arms. "Now listen to me, big child. You know I'm not the curious type, and I'm not here to judge you. Say nothing if you prefer it that way, but let yourself be looked after. You're going straight to bed now. In the meantime, I'll fix you a nice light supper and bring it to you myself, all right? And if you have a fever in the night, I'll make you a tisane." That was when Jacques collapsed to the floor. "At last," she sighed, a little weary as she reached for the bell cord. Jacques had a terminal aneurysm, and his mother had a lover, one who didn't want to become a stepfather. This simple little tragedy took place 3 years ago, not far from Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The house where it happened now belongs to a demolition contractor.